You're not awakening. You're in a spiritual emergency. The gnawing anxiety, the suffocating isolation, the feeling of going mad while the world remains indifferent. All of this isn't a sign of error, but an inevitable part of the process. Carl Jung called this journey the maritime night of the soul, a dark and devastating plunge where all the illusions that sustained your identity begin to crumble. What many call awakening is, in fact, destruction. Not an accidental fall, but a deliberate collapse, which rips away every mask, every psychological defense used to survive. It's not weakness, it's a flawed map. The psyche resists because it doesn't desire truth. It simply desires to stay alive. The question isn't whether you're ready to awaken, but whether you'll be able to navigate the darkness without losing yourself completely. Imagine a man at the height of his career, respected, influential, with a well-structured family and recognized by the scientific community. At 38, Carl Gustav Jung possessed everything society considers a sign of success. And yet, it was at this moment that he deliberately chose to delve into what he would call his confrontation with the unconscious. For 6 years, he faced intense visions, voices that seemed to come from another world, images of destruction, blood, and death. He himself wrote, "I was threatened by psychosis. Anyone else would have been institutionalized, labeled insane, and erased from history. His family believed he had lost his mind. His colleagues abandoned him. He, however, recorded each vision in his red book, dialogues with archetypal figures, images of demons, prophets, and inner sages. There, Jung sought not comfort, but confrontation. He discovered that to achieve something true, he would need to endure the ruin of his persona, the collapse of normalcy, the loss of everything that made him functional in the eyes of others. This initial case is not just Jung's biography. It is the archetype of all who embark on the path of awakening. There is no enlightenment without prior disintegration. There is no achievement without a period in which you seem to have lost absolutely everything. Many who tread this path choose one of 3 exits. They retreat and return to sleep, they functionally collapse, or they construct a spiritual persona even more illusory than the previous one. Few accept the price of continuing, of allowing each layer of identity to be stripped away until nothing recognizable remains. The value of this example lies in revealing the nature of the crossing. Jung didn't just study the abyss, he inhabited it. He didn't describe madness theoretically. He lived with it, conversed with its figures, integrated them. And that's precisely why his map is so devastating and yet so useful. It doesn't offer shortcuts, but teaches how to withstand the impact. Anyone who faces extreme anxiety today, who feels their minds crumbling, is repeating the same crossing on an individual level. Jung's case shows us that awakening is not the conquest of light, but the controlled descent into darkness. Victory is not avoiding madness, but passing through it without being consumed. This is the starting point for everything that follows. For decades, many dismissed Jung's experience as mystical delusions or a controlled psychotic crisis. But modern science, ironically, has validated much of what he described in his descent into the dark night of the soul. Today, research in psychology, psychiatry, and neuroscience recognizes a phenomenon called spiritual emergence, intense states of consciousness that can either become clinical breakdowns or profound transformations, depending on how they are integrated. Studies by Stanislav and Christina Grof in the 1980s already indicated that intense mystical experiences, visions, ego dissolution, and symbolic encounters with inner figures are not necessarily symptoms of psychosis. Often, they are expressions of the unconscious seeking to reorganize the psyche. They called these states crises of spiritual transformation. This echoes exactly what Jung described. It is not weakness, but a struggle of the psyche to be born into another level of consciousness. Neuroscience has also contributed relevant data. Functional magnetic resonance imaging studies show that during intense mystical or meditative experiences, areas related to the narrative self, such as the medial prefrontal cortex and the default mode network, reduce their activity. At the same time, regions linked to primordial emotions, creativity, and symbolic perception are activated. In other words, the brain enters a state in which everyday identity dissolves, making room for profound and often chaotic contents to emerge. Jung would have called this a confrontation with the unconscious. Another important field of study comes from trauma psychology. Researchers like Bessel van der Kolk show that repressed memories and buried emotions return in altered states of consciousness. bringing not only pain but also the potential for reorganization. The mechanism is clear. What was repressed must return for the psyche to become whole. For Jung, this is the essence of the shadow. Everything that has been rejected, forgotten, or denied, but which remains alive in the psychic depths. Even the default mode network theory supports Jungian ideas. This neural network, responsible for maintaining our identity and life narrative, can be temporarily silenced during states of deep meditation or psychedelic experiences. What emerges from this silence are often archetypal images, universal figures, and symbolic patterns that belong not only to the individual, but to the collective psyche, exactly what Jung called the collective unconscious. At the same time, contemporary psychology confirms the danger of these experiences when left unattended. People experiencing misunderstood spiritual emergencies may be diagnosed as psychotic and medicated until their symptoms disappear. But without integration, the transformative potential is lost. Jung warned of this. The shadow doesn't disappear because it's ignored. It merely grows stronger underground, waiting for its moment to explode. Even in creativity research, scientists recognize that unconscious incubation is fundamental. Great insights emerge when hidden content emerges into consciousness. Jung called this source of creativity the shadow. Science calls it unconscious processes. The terms change, but the mechanics are the same. What we reject, if integrated, restores strength, originality, and vitality. Thus, what once seemed like the delusion of an eccentric psychiatrist now finds support in empirical data. Jung not only survived internal chaos but also described a map that resonates with modern discoveries about neural networks, emotional repression, trauma, and creativity. The conclusion is clear. Spiritual awakening is both a clinical risk and a potential for transformation. What defines the outcome is not the phenomenon itself, but the ability to integrate what emerges. This scientific validation reinforces Jung's central intuition. The human psyche seeks not only to remain stable, but also to evolve. And to evolve, it must disintegrate before reintegrating. It's not weakness. It's the very process of psychological renewal. Jung observed that awakening fails not because people are weak, but because they fall into three invisible traps. He described them as inescapable psychic mechanisms, forces that emerge whenever someone gets too close to inner truth. They are, so to speak, landmines in the field of consciousness. 1. The shadow eruption. Everything you've repressed throughout your life, anger, sexuality, selfishness, power, even joy, returns brutally. The individual who built an identity of kindness encounters cruel fantasies. The one who prided himself on intelligence sees his stupidity exposed. The responsible person discovers within himself a core of chaos. The shadow doesn't ask for permission. It erupts, demanding to be acknowledged. Anyone who tries to deny it goes mad or collapses. 2. The inflation of the ego. When a person begins to have genuine spiritual experiences, visions, intuitions, synchronicities, the ego quickly creeps in. It appropriates the content and claims, "I am special, I am chosen, I am awakened." This deception is even more dangerous than being asleep, for it mixes real experience with unconscious arrogance. The result is messianism, delusions of grandeur, and inevitable downfall. 3. The problem of return. Even those who integrate the shadow and relativize the ego face the ultimate test, returning to human society. Here the hero encounters resistance, mockery, and subtle manipulation. The group doesn't tolerate anyone becoming different, because their authenticity betrays the collective unconscious. The price of remaining awake is the risk of isolation. The price of adapting is losing the achievement. Few can sustain this tension. These three categories, shadow, ego, and return, make up Jung's conceptual map for awakening. They are not personal flaws, but universal laws of the psyche. Everyone who traverses the dark night will inevitably face these three dragons. The difference lies not in avoiding them, but in how we choose to face them. Jung never described awakening as a sudden event of enlightenment, but as a long process, made up of painful and inevitable phases. Each of them marks a death and a birth, and none can be skipped without consequences. 1. Disintegration. The beginning is always marked by the collapse of the old identity. Symptoms: extreme anxiety, loss of meaning, a feeling of madness. The once solid persona cracks. The individual discovers they are not who they believed they were. It is a plunge into the nocturnal sea of the soul. 2. The shadow eruption. With the ancient structure in ruins, repressed contents invade consciousness. Violent dreams, forbidden desires, disturbing images. Here, the temptation is to flee or deny, but the task is to endure, to recognize that the monster is a legitimate part of the psyche. 3. The battle with the ego. If the shadow is integrated, the next struggle arises. The ego refuses to be dethroned. It infiltrates spiritual experiences and attempts to monopolize them. This is where delusions of grandeur and illusions of being special arise. The cure is to relativize the ego, not to destroy it, but to put it in its proper place. 4. The void. Once neither the old persona nor the inflated ego dominates, the individual falls into the abyss, without a fixed identity, without certainties, without ground. This is the most dangerous phase, as the mind seeks to cling to new rigid systems, dogmas, cults, absolute beliefs. Resisting the void is crucial. Inner silence prepares the ground for something new. 5. The return. Integrated and relativized, the individual must return to the world. Here they encounter resistance, ridicule, and rejection. It is the ultimate test, remaining awake among the slumbering without giving in to the pressure to adapt again. 6. Individuation. If all phases are traversed, a new way of existing emerges. Not perfect enlightenment, but integration. The person is neither good nor bad, but whole. They recognize themselves as a living paradox, encompassing light and darkness, conscious and unconscious, human and spiritual. For Jung, these phases don't occur in a straight line, but in a spiral. They repeat themselves in cycles, each time becoming deeper. The process never ends. It simply becomes a way of life. One of the most emblematic examples of the journey described by Jung was Saint John of the Cross, a 16th century mystic. Known for his poetry on the dark night of the soul, he accurately described what Jung would later call the descent into the unconscious. Imprisoned and tortured by his own religious companions, isolated in a damp cell, John experienced hallucinations, bouts of despair, and a feeling of utter abandonment. However, instead of denying the darkness, he immersed himself in it, transforming suffering into poetic language that has spanned centuries. His experience shows that the dark night is not a flaw, but an essential part of the process. The pain that seemed like destruction turned out to be a passage to a deeper consciousness. Like Jung, John demonstrated that the path to integration is not immediate light, but rather enduring the darkness until meaning emerges from it. Another powerful example of crossing the abyss is that of Friedrich Nietzsche. A 19th century philosopher, he experienced a process that deeply resonates with what Jung would later describe. Nietzsche began his journey as a brilliant academic, but his restless mind led him to question the foundations of Western culture, religion, morality, and truth. In proposing the death of God, he was not celebrating nihilism, but describing a collective psychological catastrophe, the loss of all transcendental references that gave meaning to life. This rupture wasn't limited to his ideas. Nietzsche went through a personal disintegration, nervous breakdowns, visions, physical and mental breakdowns. He spent long periods in isolation, writing intense and fragmented texts in which he denounced both human weakness and the possibility of overcoming it through the Übermensch, the man capable of creating meaning even without external guarantees. This archetypal figure was not an invulnerable hero, but someone who traversed the void without succumbing to it. The danger of the shadow was present in his work, outbursts of anger, resentment, and contempt for mediocrity. The risk of ego inflation also haunted him. Nietzsche often believed himself on a grand mission to reveal truths inaccessible to the rest of humanity. Ultimately, he faced the problem of return. His philosophy was misinterpreted, distorted, and rejected by his contemporaries, isolating him in a world that could not bear his views. His life ended in mental collapse, but the impact of his journey remained. Jung recognized in Nietzsche not only the danger of inflation, but also the courage to face the void without taking refuge in facile dogmas. The philosopher became an example of the terrible price that awakening can exact when there are no adequate tools to support the psyche. Nietzsche's case shows how the process of individuation can be both creative and devastating. He didn't find balance, but he bequeathed to humanity a radical vision of the need to traverse the darkness. His life embodies the drama of the soul that dares to descend where few dare to look. Few aspects of the spiritual awakening described by Jung are as devastating as its impact on human relationships. The process doesn't happen in complete isolation. It reverberates in interactions with family, friends, and coworkers. And this is where one of the most difficult tests arises: remaining awake in a world that prefers unconsciousness. The first rupture occurs in family intimacy. The individual who begins to change becomes uncomfortable, not because they want to attack or provoke, but because their mere presence betrays them. Each more authentic gesture, each more honest word, acts as a mirror that exposes the masks of others. The collective unconscious reacts predictably. Subtle criticism, attempts to discredit, or even emotional blackmail. Phrases like, "You're not the same anymore," or "I miss who you were," carry within them the weight of unconscious manipulation, not necessarily out of malice, but out of fear of the unknown. Jung called this participation mystique, the unconscious fusion that unites groups, families, and communities. When someone awakens, they break this fusion, and this rupture is felt by others as abandonment, betrayal, even symbolic death. Thus, even unintentionally, the awakened person is accused of coldness, arrogance, or madness. The dilemma becomes cruel: remain faithful to one's conscience or turn back to preserve emotional bonds. In the broader social sphere, the problem is no less significant. Work environments, friendship circles, and everyday interactions demand a certain degree of conformity. The awakened, upon perceiving unconscious dynamics, power plays, subtle manipulations, projections, find themselves in an untenable position. Speaking the truth destroys coexistence. Remaining silent destroys oneself. Many end up isolating themselves, not out of pride, but out of psychological necessity. Jung did the same. He built his tower in Bollingen as a sacred space, not for escape, but for survival. The practical implications of this process are profound. An awakened person must learn to moderate their exposure to the unconscious world, practicing what Jung called selective participation. Small doses of interaction, interspersed with periods of retreat and inner reconstruction, allow for balance. This alternation creates a kind of psychic immunity. The individual does not dissolve into the collective, but neither does he isolate himself to the point of madness. Another crucial aspect is communication. The awakened discover that they cannot simply explain their experience, not because they lack vocabulary, but because ordinary language does not reach broader states of consciousness. Any attempt to translate generates misunderstandings, accusations of arrogance, or misunderstandings. Thus, the practical task is not to convince but to embody. It is to live in such a way that transformation is visible as presence, not as discourse. This impact also manifests in intimate relationships. Romantic partners often feel threatened by profound changes in each other. Love, which should be a space for growth, can become a battleground between the desire for authenticity and the need for security. Many awakenings destroy marriages, not because the love is gone, but because the new awareness reveals incompatibilities that are impossible to ignore. However, there are also positive results. Superficial relationships dissolve, making room for more authentic bonds. True friendships withstand shock, adapt, and transform. The social circle shrinks but gains density. Interactions, though fewer, become more meaningful. From a practical standpoint, awakening teaches us to sustain tension without seeking immediate escape. This skill, holding the tension of opposites, is perhaps Jung's greatest legacy to life and society. Persisting between the old and the new, between adaptation and authenticity, between silence and speech, requires inner discipline and emotional courage. Ultimately, human relationships prove to be a testing ground. It's not enough to cross the shadow or relativize the ego. It's necessary to return to coexistence and not lose oneself in it. Awakening is only complete when inner transformation translates into a living presence, capable of interacting with the world without succumbing to it. If Jung's map for awakening offers directions, traps are shortcuts that promise relief but lead to ruin. They are not occasional accidents. They are recurring patterns that emerge in virtually everyone who traverses the dark night. 1. The escape into illusory spiritualism. Faced with pain, many turn to practices that promise quick transcendence. Gurus, vibrational elevation techniques, communities that preach only love and light. The problem is that this escape ignores the shadow. Instead of integrating repressed content, the person covers it with a layer of forced positivity. This is the essence of spiritual bypassing, appearing awake while becoming increasingly fragmented. 2. The dramatization of the shadow. Another mistake is to confuse contact with dark content as permission to experience it blindly. Those who dream about violence, for example, may act destructively, believing they are embracing the shadow. Jung warned, the shadow must be integrated, not acted out. Dramatization doesn't generate awareness. It only reinforces unconscious possession. 3. The collapse of the ego. Many misinterpret the idea of ego death and attempt to destroy it completely. The result is not enlightenment, but psychic disorganization, a loss of a sense of reality, an inability to function in daily life, and psychotic episodes. Jung emphasized, the ego must not be annihilated, but relativized, repositioned as part of the whole, not as absolute master. 4. The trap of collective salvation. It's common for individuals when experiencing intense experiences to believe they have a mission to save or awaken others. This spiritual inflation masks internal insecurity and quickly degenerates into messianism. The danger is not only personal but collective. Entire groups can be swept away by inflated leaders who confuse genuine visions with personal greatness. 5. The poorly conducted return. Even after profound progress, many fail to reintegrate into ordinary life. They seek external approval, try to maintain relationships based on old dynamics, and give in to the pressure to be the same as before. Little by little, they dilute their achievement until it's only a distant memory. It's the quietest form of defeat, surviving without ever being whole again. These traps exist because the unconscious struggles to preserve its previous equilibrium. The process of individuation requires constant vigilance, recognizing the temptation of shortcuts, enduring tension without escape, choosing awareness over comfort. There was a woman, a successful lawyer, mother of 2, married for over a decade. In everyone's eyes, her life was impeccable. Financial stability, professional reputation, structured family. However, inside, she was in a state of disarray, anxiety, panic attacks, insomnia. She sought therapeutic help and, in the process, unwittingly began what Jung called a confrontation with the unconscious. At first, the visions came in dreams. Ruined houses, rivers of blood, menacing animals. She ignored them until they began to emerge in full wakefulness. Violent fantasies, images of abandonment, repressed desires. Frightened, she thought she was going crazy. The therapist explained. It wasn't madness, but the shadow emerging. Everything she had repressed for decades demanded recognition. The next phase was even more devastating. In the midst of an intense meditation experience, he felt he had touched God. For weeks, he experienced impossible to ignore coincidences, unlikely encounters, phrases spoken by strangers that seemed like direct messages, one synchronicity after another. His ego inflamed. He convinced himself he was chosen, that he had a spiritual mission. He even wrote a manifesto to guide humanity. But little by little, the delusion crumbled. His practical life crumbled. He neglected his children, distanced himself from his husband, and nearly lost his job. He was on the road to ruin. It was at this point that Jung's guidance proved crucial, not to destroy the ego but to relativize it, to realize that she was not the source of the message, only the recipient, that the numinous passed through her, but did not belong to her. This recognition saved her from a messianic collapse. Still, the final test remained, her return. Upon returning to her family with a renewed sense of self, she faced subtle rejection. Her husband would say, "I miss the fun-loving woman you were." Her mother would insinuate she was ill. Friends would ridicule her in veiled conversations. "Look at the bright one there." Each encounter was an unconscious attempt to pull her back into her old role. For months, she oscillated between two pains, that of being rejected or that of betraying herself. It was then that he understood what Jung called selective participation. He began to regulate his presence. He created his own spaces, solitary walks, a room transformed into a symbolic refuge, and established clear boundaries. He didn't seek to convince anyone, but he also no longer betrayed his own conscience. Instead of isolating himself completely, he learned to remain between two worlds, present for his family, but faithful to what he had achieved. The process didn't have a glorious ending. There was no perfect enlightenment, just a more real life. She remained a lawyer, a mother, a wife, but whole now. She no longer needed to pretend to be just the efficient professional or the understanding woman. She recognized the anger, the sensuality, the ambition, the fragility. She saw in them not enemies, but legitimate parts of herself. What emerged was not a saint, but a conscious woman, capable of carrying the weight of her own contradictions. This case demonstrates what Jung meant when he said, "I would rather be whole than good." The lawyer didn't become morally perfect or spiritually special. She became real, and this reality, paradoxical and imperfect, was the true fruit of awakening. In the end, the awakening didn't destroy his life, it only destroyed the lie that sustained his life. What remained was simpler, more human, and therefore more truthful. Spiritual awakening is not a prize, it's a sentence, dying to what you believed you were. Jung taught us that survival isn't the goal, transformation is. The collapse you fear is merely the dissolution of the false. The pain you feel is proof that something real is being born. If the journey seems unbearable, remember, it's not madness. It's the sanity the world insists on calling delirium. The question isn't how to survive and die, but will you allow this process to complete you? If this truth resonates with you, sign up. Here, we delve into the ideas most don't dare to face.